Chapter 4. Pescadero State Hospital, January. "Your girlfriend's back," Frances said, and laughed, her eyes filled with malicious glee. Sarah didn't even have to look up to know that Loretta was indeed in the room. She'd developed a radar about her. Besides, she never stopped sniffling. It was hard to miss. Quite a number of patients had vanished over the holidays, to return one by one. Loretta was among the last to be let out. One positive note was that Sarah knew she wasn't simply being paranoid. The other patients had noticed Loretta's attention and frequently commented on it. Some positive note, Sarah thought. I know I'm sane, and I'm constantly looking for ways to back up my opinion. How healthy is that? Frances licked her lips. I think she wants to. You're going to work so hard at distracting me that you're going to distract yourself, Sarah warned. That's how I won all your blue chips last time. Frances pouted, but she shut up. They were playing gin rummy for battered poker chips. The other two players were usually silent, playing the game grimly, as if it were a matter of life and death. But suddenly Allison froze as she picked up a card, becoming so agitated that she actually gurgled instead of speaking. Donna turned with a frown to see what she was staring at, and turned back with a little gasp. She began fiddling with her cards nervously, her dark eyes darting left and right. Frances deigned to look up and also froze. Then she put down her cards, got up, and walked away. Allison and Donna looked at each other over the table and started to rise. Wait a minute, Sarah said, taking Donna's wrist. What's going on? She had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was staring at her, someone who meant her no good. But she was damned if she was going to turn around and give Loretta the satisfaction of seeing her unnerved. I can't, Donna whispered. I've got to. She. The woman wrenched her hand free and fled, muttering, Allison nervously crowding her wake. Looking around, Sarah saw that almost everyone was leaving the common room, giving Loretta and the large woman beside her a wide berth. Sarah rose and moved over to Elisa, a small Puerto Rican woman with, she'd been told, a serious death wish. What's going on? She asked her in a whisper. Elisa tore her eyes away from the woman at the door to look at Sarah. That's Tanya, she said, nodding at the woman. She's pretty much crazy. She grinned when she realized what she'd said. I mean, out of control. What's your back insane? She's so out of it, she even uses her teeth. A lot. One of the nurses is still having plastic surgery. Then maybe we should go, Sarah suggested. If Loretta was escorting such a person into her vicinity, it couldn't be good. No, I hope she notices me, Elisa said, her eyes eager. I haven't had a good fight in a long time. Good luck, Sarah said. I'm out of here. Loretta was a small woman, nervous in her manner, with constantly shifting eyes and an inclination to take advantage of people. Sarah had realized this within 10 minutes of making her acquaintance, and had taken to avoiding her as much as possible. It had probably been Sarah's notoriety that had attracted Loretta's attention, and a desire to bask in Sarah's reflected glory. She'd taken Sarah's unspoken rejection with very ill grace. As Sarah walked towards the doorway, Loretta spoke to her for the first time. "Where you going, Connor?" she asked, her voice friendly, her eyes not. "I'm tired. I'm going to my room." "Nah, you're not tired." Loretta moved over and took her arm. Sarah felt every muscle in her body tighten at the touch, resenting the sure knowledge that there was going to be trouble. She forced herself to allow the woman her way, to tug her over to Tanya. Any demonstration of anger, however justified at this stage, could count against her, even if the witnesses were as insane as Loretta and Tanya. That was the trouble with being notorious. You could be telling the truth with complete accuracy, and still no one would believe you. "This is my friend Tanya. I told her all about you, Sarah. She'd like to play gin with you. Wouldn't you, Tanya?" Tanya nodded, looking at Sarah as if she were a big, juicy steak, and she was a hungry dog. "Hey, Elisa!" Loretta snapped. "Take a hike." Elisa's jaw dropped at the effrontery. She gave Loretta a disdainful look and settled deeper into her chair. "No," she said, making eye contact with Tanya for good measure. Sarah could almost see Tanya begin to quiver like a Doberman waiting for the attack command. "I don't like her," Tanya growled. "Come on, ladies," Loretta said, placing a hand in the center of both of their backs. "Sit down and play." She gave them each a little shove, and Sarah, glancing over her shoulder, saw her face change. "This is not good," she thought as she took her chair and looked up at Tanya. "Not good at all." She signaled to Elisa to come and join them, but the younger woman shook her head, smiling. Tanya turned at Loretta's shove to glare at her, and Sarah saw Loretta wink. Then Tanya looked at Sarah and smiled. Not a nice smile, not one intended to soothe or make friends. It was a smile directed at something nasty going on inside her own head. Sarah took a deep breath and picked up the cards, shuffling them neatly, and then dealing. Tanya watched the pile of cards before her grow without picking them up. When Sarah was finished, she placed the deck between them and picked up her own cards. Tanya continued to stare at the pile in front of her. "Why didn't you ask me to deal?" she demanded. Her eyes rose to meet Sarah's challengingly. "Did you want to? You can if you like," Sarah said agreeably, putting her hand back onto the deck. Tanya looked at the deck, then looked at Sarah. "You were awful eager to get rid of that hand," she observed. "Anybody'd think there was something wrong with it." Okay, Sarah thought. Looks like I'm going to have a fight whether I start one or not. Still, she'd do her best to avoid it. "Not at all," she said aloud. "I just honestly don't care who deals. If you don't want to play cards, we can play something else. Like checkers." "I don't like checkers," Tanya said, as though the mere suggestion were an insult. Sarah braced herself, certain from the way Tanya was stoking herself up that at any moment she was going to be attacked. She'd seen this kind of behavior often years ago when she'd been here before. If memory served, on occasion she'd done this sort of thing herself. Tanya grinned. "It's okay. Take your cards. I'll deal the next hand." Sarah reached out for the deck, and even though she was expecting it, Tanya almost got her. As Sarah's hand touched the cards, Tanya's flashed forward to impale the deck with a big pen. Connor thrust her chair back and started to rise when Loretta struck her viciously on the side of the head with a sock filled with change or metal washers or some such. Sarah went down, striking her head on the table, hard, then hit the floor, aware but absolutely helpless. Tanya looked at Loretta and smiled when the smaller woman gestured at Sarah as though presenting a gift. Tanya climbed up onto the table and crawled across to look down at Sarah, then looked at Loretta, almost coquettishly. "Do you have a pen?" she asked. "Mine's broken." Loretta grinned at her fondly. "Honey, I've got two." She handed them over. Tanya took one in each hand and began to laugh. Sarah stared up at her, still unable to move. The last thing she clearly remembered seeing was Tanya flowing off the table onto her, the pens poised like daggers. Then the points came down. Elisa screamed at the sight and jumped up from her chair. The scream came from pure rage, prompted by jealousy, but it had the same effect as a cry of horror. Staff came running from all directions. Loretta turned on her with a snarl, then moved as far away from Tanya as she could. At first, the orderlies came sprinting towards Elisa, but she quickly pointed towards Tanya. Tanya's hands, bloody almost to the elbows, rose again and plunged down, and a spreading pool of blood beckoned. The orderlies changed direction, one of them yelling into his radio for a doctor. Soon there was a cluster of orderlies hauling Tanya off the unconscious Sarah, as Tanya screamed furiously and tried to bite. "She started it!" Elisa said to the orderly who had led her away, pointing at Loretta. "She put Tanya up to it. Then she hit Sarah, and then... The orderly shushed her and led her to her room, followed by a nurse carrying a syringe full of neomorph. "She set it up!" Elisa insisted. "Come on, honey," the nurse said, urging Elisa into her room. "We'll make you feel better." "You're not listening!" And they wouldn't, she knew. No one believed crazy people. Dr. Simon Ray ran his fingers through his short blonde hair, then rested his elbows on his desk and dropped his face into his hands. This was unbelievable. You'd think Pescadero was some snake pit. How had this happened? Didn't anyone notice how dysfunctional Loretta was? How dangerous Tanya was? How could they have allowed her to go to the common room? This was a disaster. He had one patient, a very famous patient at that, laid out with multiple stab wounds and complications to her liver. One patient was accusing another of setting it up, and the board was demanding to know why someone as dangerous as Tanya Firkin was mingling with the other patients. This was worse than a disaster. This was actionable. He sat back with a heavy sigh, resting his head on the back of his chair. There was a sharp rap on his door, making him start. Then the door opened, and a tall, thin, middle-aged man walked in. "Where's my secretary?" Ray asked. "I've no idea," the intruder said. "Off photocopying something, I suppose." Or she should be. He'd given her $100 to find a chore that would take her away from her desk for 10 minutes. Ray stood up, not certain what to do. The man radiated confidence, so he wasn't someone's troubled parent. And he wasn't dressed like a patient. Then his heart sank. The stranger looked like a lawyer. "How can I help you?" the doctor asked. "First, by listening to my suggestions, and then by taking them." The man helped himself to a seat. "My name is Poole." Ray stood for a moment longer, then sat himself. "Suggestions?" he asked in confusion. "You've got a disaster on your hands, Doctor," Poole said. The doctor studied his visitor, weighing his observation and finding it only a statement of fact. "Go on," he invited. Poole's thin lips quirked in a straight smile. "My suggestion is that you move Sarah Connor to minimum security while she recovers," he said. "And then you should petition to have her moved to a halfway house." "I've already asked to have her moved to minimum," Ray said. "I don't think it would be good for a patient to be left to recover in the same place where she'd been so badly hurt. Besides, it will be weeks, possibly even months, before she'd be capable of hurting anybody." "Which is why the board approved the transfer," Poole said. Ray shook his head. "I haven't heard back yet." "They've approved it," Poole said. Surprised, Ray studied him for a moment. "Mr. Poole, just Poole." "All right then, Poole, just what is your interest in the Connor case?" "My interest is none of your business," Poole said, rising. "And in your own interests, I suggest you leave it that way. I do have an interest in seeing to it that a talented physician, such as yourself, achieves the kind of success and recognition that he deserves. I understand there's going to be an opening at the Glen Ellen Psychiatric Group. I believe you once applied to be an associate there, didn't you? The doctor blinked, wondering how this man could know that. Yes, he said. It's very desirable. Poole interrupted. When Miss Connor is sufficiently recovered, petition to have her transferred to a halfway house. I think you have an unrealistic idea of how quickly these things happen, Ray said dismissively. Oh, I think you'll find the board most cooperative. Poole gave him that little smile. You do it, and do submit your application to Glen Ellen. Think of how much it will boost your reputation to bring the mad bomber, Sarah Connor, from madness to sanity in under 2 years. Do you think she's sane? Ray asked, genuinely curious. Poole turned with his hand on the doorknob. Really, Doctor, how would I know? I'm not a psychiatrist. Then he left. Huh, Ray said. Joining the Glen Ellen group was just one of the goals he needed to achieve, according to his personal game plan. Poole had implied, Ray was certain he'd implied, that pending his actions regarding Sarah Connor, his next application would be accepted. The psychiatrist refused to acknowledge the word bribe when it floated into his consciousness. Poole had merely pointed out certain obvious facts. It would do his reputation good to have Connor recover her mental health so quickly. That is, if he was convinced in his own mind that she wasn't a danger to society. But he had been thinking that things were looking good for her. Very good indeed. Perhaps he should do as Poole had suggested. Montana. Clea sat absolutely still. One small part of her consciousness monitored the activity of the Terminator on the roof as it upgraded their solar power system. The highly capable remainder of her mind was learning from the future experiences of Serena Burns. When she'd been younger, Clea had very much enjoyed these lessons, particularly those which allowed her to view Burns's exchanges with Skynet. Especially those moments when Skynet actually took possession of Serena's implanted computer, essentially becoming Serena. Now she found that they depressed her, reminding her forcefully of what she would never have, never know. Once she actually took up her assignment, Clea was certain that her emotions would settle down. This tendency to brood might well be a side effect of her chemically induced rush to maturity. Certainly, she found Serena's light-heartedness inappropriate and her cheerfulness obnoxious. Clea was glad she'd never met her progenitor face to face. The I-950 was sure she'd have been unable to avoid terminating Serena. The memory she was reviewing today was of Serena's time with the soldiers of the future, when she was infiltrating the enemy in the human Skynet war. She closed her eyes and saw Lieutenant Zeller coming towards her. This was how she saw all of these memories, from behind Serena's eyes, as though they were happening to her. The year 2029. Burns, Zeller said, looking grim. She made a gesture that indicated the infiltrator should follow, and stalked off. Serena tilted her head, then followed. As she walked, she reviewed all of her actions from the past week and found nothing to worry about. Yes, she'd managed to get poor Corman Gonzalez killed, but there was no way the lieutenant could connect her with it. She'd risked directing a small herd of T-90s to the Corman's station behind the lines. Such lines as they had. True, it had been a calculated risk. There was always the chance that someone, somewhere, might be monitoring in hopes of detecting such signals. But finding the source in the middle of a firefight when the whole episode had lasted mere seconds was remote in the extreme. Besides, Zeller always looked grim. It was just as likely she wanted to recruit the infiltrator for some hazardous secret attack. If so, excellent. She wouldn't be able to return to Zeller's unit, but some other, distant group would take her to their collective bosom. They made their way to a secluded glen, and Zeller turned on her heel to glare at Burns. "I don't know how you did it, but I know you killed him," she snarled. Serena blinked. "What?" she said. "Who?" It could, after all, have been one of a lot of people. "Gonzalez!" Zeller stepped a little closer, shaking her head, her mouth a bitter line, her shoulders slightly hunched forward. "He liked you. He liked everybody, and all he wanted to do was help people. How could you?" The infiltrator allowed her mouth to drop open in a feigned astonishment, and she couldn't help it. She laughed, trying to make it sound nervous. "What the hell are you talking about, ma'am?" she said. "I wasn't anywhere near Gonzalez when those T-90s found him. There's no way I could possibly have had anything to do with his death." Serena watched Zeller straighten up, but her glare didn't diminish. Instead, contempt twisted her attractive features into something like a sneer. "I haven't trusted you from the first moment I saw you," she said. "Sometimes you can just smell trouble, and you, Burns, stank of it from day one. I'm gonna be watching you, bitch. Watching who you team up with, watching who you go off with. I tell you right now." She shoved her finger in Serena's face. "They'd better come back alive." The infiltrator gave a deep sigh and reached out, intending to break the lieutenant's slender neck. Instead, the sweeping hand met Zeller's knife. Serena clamped down on the pain and clenched the fist, jerking the human's weapon away. Zeller's eyes went wide as Serena's face stayed mask calm, despite the bloody wound. "You're one of them!" she gasped, snatching for the plasma rifle slung over her shoulder. "But you can't be!" Inefficient. Serena batted the muzzle aside as the burst of stripped ions tore past her ear. "If you'd have just shot, you might have gotten me." Zeller clubbed her across the side of the face with the butt of the rifle, and Serena caught her in a bear hug and began to squeeze. Knees, fists, and a small holdout knife struck her again and again. With what must have been the last of her strength, Zeller plunged the knife into the I-950's side, high up, as though seeking the heart. Serena felt the knife puncture her lung and gave the lieutenant a fierce, impatient shake. If she couldn't smother the stupid bitch, breaking her spine would do nicely. With a gasp, Zeller went limp, and the infiltrator dropped her. Infrared confirmed that the body was losing warmth. Not something the cleverest human could fake. With a spasm of coughing, Serena fell, bleeding, beside the corpse of Lieutenant Zeller, and lay watching the leaf shadow rustle against the sky, while a few hopeful crows looked down and waited. She woke one of the T-90s she'd secreted nearby in a resting state, gave it her location, and ordered it to come to the Dell and destroy itself in such a way that it would look as though she had done it. The T-90 acknowledged the communication and broke off. Laying her aching head back down and rolling onto her side to avoid drowning in her own blood, Serena ordered her computer to moderate the damage she'd taken so that she wouldn't die before help arrived. She could actually feel the bleeding slow as veins and arteries clamped down, almost stopping the flow. Without doubt, she would need time to recuperate in the base hospital. She licked her lips. Perhaps it was time to move on. Zeller might well have revealed her fears to someone else. There was a clicking sound. The T-90's approach. Serena saw it coming up over the rim of the shallow little dell and closed her eyes, allowing herself to go unconscious, confident that the Terminator would follow her instructions to the letter. Montana, the present. Clea frowned. There. That was exactly the sort of thing that annoyed her about her predecessor. Failing to take notice of how those around her might interpret her actions. Having no backup plan. What if Zeller had decided to accuse the infiltrator in front of a crowd? It was obvious that all Serena had planned to do, if she'd even planned anything at all, was to bluff. Such lax behavior had been a hallmark of all of her missions. It was the product of overconfidence, in Clea's opinion, which, given the many successes that humans were having at the time Serena was sent back, was inexcusable. Letting out an annoyed breath, Clea bit her lip. She was supposed to be learning from these studies, yet all she seemed to be gleaning from Serena's experiences was how much she disliked her. With a shake of her head, she rose and went to her lab. At least there she could be doing her own work, not imitating her highly unsuccessful parent. Encinas Halfway House, Los Angeles, September. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded demurely in her lap, looking alert. Hell, I'm feeling alert. As Dr. Ray turned into the driveway of the halfway house. It had once been a grammar school in the Spanish mission style, 2 stories tall with large windows. The land around it had been carved away, probably when it was sold or converted to the halfway house. Where the playground had once been, there stood a small and not very attractive office building, about 4 stories tall, built in the 70s from the look of it. Around the halfway house was a chain-link fence that had no gate. A few bushes flanked the foundation, each one standing alone and straggly behind a narrow belt of dying grass. "Are you sure you're not going to get into trouble for placing me here, Doctor?" she asked anxiously. Ray smiled condescendingly. "The board approved your move to minimum security." Sarah laughed and indicated the barless windows on the house beside them. "That's pretty darn minimal." Ray nodded. "My point exactly. I've already told you that I believe the reason your psychosis worsened when you were at Pescadero was, in part, because you were so restricted, never given any trust." He glanced at the house beside them. "And you were severely over-medicated." He turned back to her with a smile. "Ready?" She took a deep breath and nodded eagerly. My God, this guy is easy to manipulate. Sarah stepped out of the car and Ray courteously took her bag from the trunk. Then he took hold of her upper arm and led her towards the front steps. Sarah let him, serene in the knowledge that the last time she'd been in the care of a Pescadero doctor, she'd have taken him out long before they reached the halfway house. She'd probably have been barreling her way towards the Canadian border for the last half hour. She knew this was a better plan. More time-consuming, perhaps, but better in the long run. Sarah was also pleased that she now had the patience to carry out such a long-range plan. Having Dieter in the picture definitely helped. Not having the unlamented Dr. Silberman stuffing her full of psychotropics and keeping her locked up like an animal also helped. As they came to the top of the stairs, the front door opened and she found herself answering the welcoming smile of Dr. Silberman before each realized who the other was. And the smiles disappeared into mutual expressions of dismay. "You," they mouthed silently at each other. Von Rossbach Estancia, Paraguay. Craig Kipfer, John wrote. Definitely up to something. He's not in science or engineering or computing. At least, not that I can discover. His name doesn't appear on any governmental payroll after his 5th year in the army, when he was honorably discharged. But his computer is hedged around with more protections than the CIA. Not that they're the very best, but that's beside the point. Just thought you might like to check him out. "You found him?" Wendy answered. "Why don't you check him out? He might just be paranoid. Lots of people are. What's he supposed to do for a living?" "Hell if I know," he wrote. "Look, if he notices that he's being watched and finds out where I'm from, he's going to think I'm more dangerous to him than I am, and probably will act accordingly. If he gets your address, he'll think a mischievous student with too much time on her hands. Besides, I honestly think you're probably better at this sort of thing than I am." "Flatterer," she wrote. "What do you mean he'll act accordingly? Do you think this dude is dangerous or something?" "Do I?" John asked himself. Would he put Wendy in danger to satisfy his curiosity about this guy? Dieter didn't recognize the name, though he agreed the guy seemed suspicious. Frankly, they didn't know enough to tell if he was dangerous or not. "I can't answer that," he admitted. "He's strange enough that I'd advise you to handle him with extreme caution. And if he does seem to become aware of you, lose his address fast. I wouldn't ask you to check him out if I thought he really was trouble, but anytime you do this stuff, you're taking a risk." "I know," Wendy agreed. "Okay, I'll look into it. I need to keep my hacking skills sharp anyway. Bye." John frowned. Kipfer's files were mysterious enough to raise a warning flag with him. With his experience, though, warning flags meant something very different than they might to Wendy. She could get herself into serious trouble. His mind shied away from the word danger. He felt vaguely guilty about possibly putting her in harm's way. "That's something I'll need to get over before I become the great military dickhead," he thought scornfully. Still. Come on. He's probably a lot less dangerous than those Luddites she used to tease. Which was almost certainly true, even if he was simply looking for an easy way out of an unpleasant feeling. Maybe the reason for this guilt was that he really wanted to get to know Wendy a bit better. He liked her voice. Maybe I could call her again, he thought. Then he remembered that she hadn't been all that impressed with him the first time they'd spoken. Of course, this time he'd be calling because he was interested in her rather than in her skills. But I don't think she'd appreciate my letting her know that. Encina's halfway house. Sarah walked. All that she could hear was the sound of her booted feet crunching through the short, dry grass. It was a beautiful day, sunny and warm. She was walking towards a playground full of laughing children and their mothers, but they made no noise. One woman in a pink waitress's uniform was putting her toddler on a rocking horse. She turned to look over her shoulder as though she'd heard someone call her name. Sarah saw her own face. This was the woman she might have become without Kyle Reese. Without the Terminator. She walked up to the chain-link fence that separated the playground from the rest of the world and put her hands through the diamond-shaped holes, watching her might-have-been self. That Sarah turned her attention back to her baby. Sarah knew what was coming. She'd been here before. She screamed for the people in the playground to take cover, but no sound came out of her mouth. She shook the fence, yelling as hard as she could, and no one heard her, and the world went on as though she didn't exist. Then it came, the blinding flash of light that set her flesh on fire and instantly killed the women and the children in the playground, followed by the blast wave that blew them apart like leaves as she clung to the fence and screamed in agony. It was dark, and a wind moaned softly as it blew through the ruins of buildings. She shifted her weight and found that she stood on uneven ground. Looking down, she saw that she was standing on bones and caught her breath when she realized they were human. Sarah. She turned at the sound of his voice and smiled to see Kyle standing a little way from her. A sob tangled with a laugh and caught in her throat. She reached towards him, but couldn't move forward. Kyle, she said softly. He stood on a little pile of skulls, looking down at her. A feeling of great sadness came over her when she realized he wasn't going to come to her. Tears filled her eyes, and her throat tightened painfully. It's not over yet, Sarah, he said. His voice was sad, his voice gentle. You have to be strong. She shook her head, but said, I know, as tears flowed down her cheeks. Kyle gave her a look of such love that her heart melted. She took a breath, but before she could speak, he began to collapse. Like a house of cards falling, he dropped to his knees, then dropped and folded, his body turning to bones before her eyes, his face staying the same. Be strong, he said. Ah! Sarah shouted, throwing herself upright in bed. You okay? Her roommate asked sleepily. Bad dream, Sarah answered, her heart pounding. Sorry, I'm okay. The woman shifted and seemed to go back to sleep. Sarah wiped tears from her cheeks and waited for her heart to slow. Then she lay back down, turned onto her side, drawing her knees up. Shit, she thought. One look at Silberman and I'm having nightmares again. She was tougher than this. She knew she was. Sarah forced her tense muscles to relax. So she'd had an unexpected reaction. It wasn't the first time in her life she'd been taken by surprise. In fact, it was very much normal for her. Be patient, Kyle. I'm not out of the game yet.